when I decided to study Cold War impact on Turkey was to show that Turkey was deeply influenced by Cold War rivalries and new political configurations of the Cold War struggles. I believe that no one can understand the political dynamics in Turkey without considering new phenomena like anti-Americanism, Islamization, and anti-communism. And I thought that these were constitutive parts of Turkish history. So today I feel very excited when I see new scholars, colleagues, and young students entering the field with a wider historical perspective and an interest in topics other than the problems of early Cold War, early Republican era. Of course, they are important, but they are not making the whole fact about Turkey.
I think we would be wrong in sort of summarizing post-Kemalist literature, or at least what needs to come after this book, only in class terms. I think political economy, political institutions, as well as political culture play an important role in shaping developments, obviously, in Turkey. And I think in order to understand what is going on, we need to make sense of each one of these different approaches. And so, for instance, in my own chapter, as for myself, like me personally, I try to base my analysis by sort of suggesting that Turkey is a country that experienced late development. And so that's why state building and nation formation processes occurred fairly recently. And generally, as a result of rapid and state-led industrialization, that creates a different sort of class dynamics as well as a political economy. So that's why I see class conflict not as a constant, but rather a variable to study. And sometimes class issues are very much politicized, as we've seen in the 1960s and 1970s, but not as salient in other periods. And particularly because of the way that Turkey is a late developing country, I think historically speaking, going all the way back to the 1950s, right-wing populist parties ended up establishing a much more popular base here in this country than their counterparts elsewhere. So I think we need to use political culture, institutions, as well as political economy to make sense of these developments. So that really was the goal. And so this is really an invitation to other scholars, students, our colleagues, to sort of join in and not just challenging the post-Kemalist literature. I think that has already begun to be done, but rather move on to new questions, new topics, new arguments, and hopefully a new paradigm.
The post-Kemalist paradigm search is actually a kind of a Trojan horse for kind of bringing back Kemalism back in or something. I think it is important to keep in mind that both Kemalist paradigm and the post-Kemalist paradigm in time became caricatures of themselves. So they become kind of exaggerated, they become simplified, reduced in their own form. And what I think is the case is that they became kind of mirror images of each other. It's like the episode of Seinfeld, the Bizarro Jerry. So it's like it's the same but a different version, in either an evil version or a more liberal version and so forth. So, and this is the main problem, that the post-Kemalist paradigm, in its caricaturized version, its exaggerated version, could not really move forward and could not also find a solution out of this dilemma.
As I see it, post-Kemalism is not a paradigm. It's a response to a dominant paradigm, which used to dominate the study of Turkish politics and society. I rather see post-Kemalism as an era in which different approaches will actually will appear, and I think as long as they comply by the scientific standards, they're all welcome. So I think there's room for class-based analysis. There is room for neo-nationalists, neo-Kemalists, or various other strands of thought. I would very much welcome them. I would hate to see Turkish studies in the future to be one more time reduced to a one and only hegemonic discourse. What happened to the post-Kemalists, right? What are they doing right now? My overall feeling is that they are being increasingly marginalized and isolated. They are like more or less solitary figures today. Some have tried to make a comeback with what I call the green Kemalism argument. I so much disagree with this, but I do not have time to say more on that. But they see an overarching line that connects Mustafa Kemal to Erdogan, right? They have this very pessimistic worldview that Turkish politics, regardless of time, it's a story of authoritarianism, right? It constantly pushes towards more authoritarian politics. They see no difference between eras, between intellectuals, between ideologies. So this green Kemalism argument, I mean, they almost make Kemalism as the brand name for authoritarianism in Turkey. And I really take issue with that. Very recently, I started to notice that there's a tendency among post-Kemalists, former post-Kemalist figures, to change their publication venues, right? They're increasingly shifting to new journals, new publication houses, or new internet outlets, new websites. And I think this is a sign of new alliances to be made in the future, or alliances from the past that are broken now.
I've worked mostly on the Young Turk period. There, I think also a great deal of changes on the way. And this is mostly related to how we read the empire to nation state shift. This has been studied mostly through a very linear and singular trajectory. And now we have way more global, comparative and connected histories. And I think this is very much challenging some of the, let's say, exclusive arguments of the post-Kemalist scholarship and relativizing some of their judgments, and also connecting some of them with the wider literature and opening up a way more interesting fields of research.
From, in terms of the political science literature, I mean, obviously, there's been a major revisionist shift on the scholarly assessment of AKP rule. Particularly since the Gezi protests. And, I never really felt this way, but obviously, and this is something that we really touch upon and criticize in our book, many post-Kemalist scholars, analysts, international observers, even, Western politicians sort of had and held high hopes of AKP's democratizing potential. And of course, the whole goal was, and the hope was, Islamists together with Kurds, the two primary groups that have been excluded from the political arena during the earlier parts of the Republican regime, would now come to surface, would mobilize, and basically together they would begin to democratize the political system, and the military tutelage was going to end. Well, all of those things happened, and yet, right, military tutelage got dismantled, but it was replaced by a partisan army. No checks and balances left. We ended up with a very vicious authoritarian cycle. Public institutions created by the Republican regime to overcome patrimonial rule have been dismantled. And in fact, the Kurds and Islamists, who sort of, were on speaking terms, tried to pursue a solution process or negotiation process. That process also died out, and it led to a massive nationalist backlash that did not really happen, at least under democratic times in the previous period. So obviously that led to a massive disillusionment in politics, but probably even more importantly, it really challenged the existing scholarship on Turkish politics. Quite frankly, I think it really renders hollow much of what has been written on Turkish politics from 2002 till 2015, which is why I think many of the existing literature right now that we cite, that we discuss, that we assign in our classes have really been written since 2015, revolving around topics that İlker really mentioned. And so that's why many post-Kemalists are silent. Others, like İlker said, are really trying to sort of shift their thesis onto a continuity sort of argument. You know, the Turkish Republic has always been authoritarian. This is just now a new chapter, but really the faults of this problem, really the main sources of the authoritarianism still go back to the earlier decades of 20th century and to the formation process of the Turkish Republic. I think there are still some scholars and analysts trying to sort of make that argument, but as far as the new literature is concerned, I think many scholars are now beginning to seek alternative sources of authoritarianism, right? Be it the Islamic political culture, what happened during Cold War, Ottoman legacy, cultural politics, anti-Alevi Kurdish tendencies, weak political institutions, and the sort of introduction of neoliberal economic reforms under a weakly institutionalized system in the 1990s, which then sort of began to change after late 2000s with the sort of rise of a sort of a neo-patrimonial capitalist sort of structure. So I think now there are alternative sources of authoritarianism that scholars are really discussing. That I think is really a very positive step. Another point that I think I should mention, not in terms of themes, but maybe methods, especially new methods that sort of began to be used more frequently by Turkish scholars. You know, because much of this post-Kemalist literature, when you come to read those texts, they're not necessarily very methodologically savvy. Most of them are thought pieces as opposed to fully fledged academic articles. But you know, over the last decade, we've seen many new historical sort of studies that came out, some of which Alp already mentioned. I think new archival sources have been discovered, and that is going to generate new research. Comparative method has been very widely used by scholars, including myself. So trying to see Turkey as part of a particular global moment, depending on what theme you're interested in, and also trying to sort of compare Turkey with other similar cases, whatever they are. It could be political parties, political institutions, political regimes, but basically looking at your case through comparative sort of prism. Obviously, large and statistical-based studies, network analysis. Computer scientists are beginning to sort of use large data, particularly through social media, to come up with new research, digital humanities. So we're really on the verge of a methodological renaissance together with these new themes that are brought forward. But I think ultimately, and this might be another sort of discussion, so I'm going to stop here, but I think what is going to happen in Turkish politics come 2023 is going to have also an impact on some of our academic discussion points, because of course, many scholars as well as politicians are now trying to engage in a reassessment of the Republic, but done retrospectively. And so far, of course, looking at the level of strength that AKP achieved over the last 15 to 20 years, many of these analyses were rather pessimistic, somber, negative, but of course things are beginning to change, so we may also see very interesting discussions emerge on that point as well, depending on political events, obviously.
I think the new scholarship treats both actors, the Islamists and the army, as partners as well as enemies. So this is a very complex interaction which receives a more nuanced perspective, and now we are starting to see that, which is very promising. And besides, now there's a tendency to see Islamism, the Islamist movement in Turkey, as a global phenomenon, which is also, I think, a good contribution, because people are now thinking more about the global environment, taking into account the global environment in their research. And for instance, in Islam, in the research on Islamism, it appears like a more importance given to the Cold War dynamics shaping Islamism in Turkey, the intervention of Saudi Arabia, the occupation of invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution. All these global phenomena are now taken into attention when they trying to understand or decode what Islamism, how Islamism became so powerful in Turkey. And this was a point emphasized by Alp. In this sense, the new scholarship is more open to analyze Turkey within as a global in a global movement, and unlike post-Kemalizm, which tend to analyze Turkey in terms of its differences from the outer world, and especially from Europe. So Turkey was always a genuine case, can be explained only in itself. This was the Kemalist interpretation of Turkish history, and it was shared by post-Kemalists as well. So I think having a global perspective is one of the most important methodological novelty we are observing today.
I am not expecting this post-Kemalism or post-Kemalism argument to make inroads into Turkey studies outside of Turkey. And this is because, I think so because, just to remind you my initial argument that academic paradigms are responses to political challenges at home. I think Turkey and Europe and United States have very different political realities currently. My colleagues elsewhere in Europe or United States are generally responding to very different kinds of political realities, especially in the United States, but to a certain extent in Europe too. People who are studying Turkey, the Middle East, Islam, Muslim peoples, they feel like they have a moral obligation to defend this community against a sea of Westerners who have no understanding of them. And this makes them, very reluctant to hear from Turkey scholars based in Turkey, that there are things wrong. Right? This was my great frustration during my sabbatical year in the United States. People really did not want to hear what I had to say about Turkey and Erdogan and AKP. So I predict that in the near future, Turkey studies is going to break into two geographical fields. Turkey studies in Turkey I think it has already, there's a very strong tendency and drive towards post-Kemalism. And I think this is going to get stronger and stronger. But on the other hand, elsewhere in Europe and United States, I think post-Kemalism is going to have a second lease on life. It will become a diaspora idea, right? A different way of studying Turks and Turkey. I think that will strike roots outside of Turkey, and we will have to deal with this, right? Two groups, two communities of scholars of Turkey producing two different strands of academic writing.
Just maybe if I can jump in very briefly, I think I position myself somewhere in between İlker and Alp's sort of approach. I'm not too optimistic about change among international scholars of Turkey, but I'm also not as pessimistic as İlker. I think post-Kemalism will remain. Certain portions of the post-Kemalist literature will sort of survive, especially as a diaspora idea. But I think we are going to sort of witness some major changes, especially if in the upcoming 2023 presidential elections, the opposition can score a victory, and we begin to sort of experience also a democratizing change in the country. Now, part of the reason for this lagging effect that I've mentioned is obviously these studies are not yet translated into English. Some of the I mean, some international scholars of Turkey do not follow the Turkish speaking literature, and there might be a lagging effect in that sense as well. Others are, I think, very much vested and interested in some political issues, right? It could be the migration crisis, it could be the Kurdish problem, it could be the Armenian genocide issue or some other issue that, they're so vested in that debate that unless they see Turkey really change its approach when it comes to that particular issue dramatically, they're not going to change their assessment of Turkey. And so we may actually come across some international observers or scholars of Turkey sort of even after government change, even after some positive democratizing changes that may happen after 2023, still really criticize Turkey and see Turkish history as part of that larger problem, because in the migration question, on the Kurdish issue or some other problem, they may not necessarily see changes that they expect, that they hope to find. I think another point that I think İlker raised an important point about how especially scholars in the West, particularly in the US, that work on countries like Turkey or Islamist movements or Islamic politics, really feel that they are sort of talking to a larger audience that knows nothing about, or that knows very little about these issues. So that's why they need to really come up with a sort of positive approach. I think that does happen. But at the same time, I think, speaking of this global moment that Alp mentioned in the previous round, I think many countries, right, ranging from Brazil to Hungary, US to India to Philippines to Poland, are really confronted with right-wing populist parties harboring authoritarian tendencies that came to power via free and fair elections, and upon coming to power, they ended up really dominating the political institutions and sort of pushing for a democratic backsliding, which in some cases led to breakdown, as it happened in Turkey. So I think Turkey is not really alone in this global moment. And in fact, just as Kemalism has come under significant challenges, both in the academic side, but also in politics, many other secular, developmentalist, nationalist regimes of the first half of 20th century have also come under challenge, right? Looking at BJP versus Congress Party in India, Likud versus Labour Party in Israel, many other cases. And I think as we begin to experience political change in these countries and maybe a decline in right-wing populism, there will be another moment for reassessment. That doesn't mean that we're going to return to the old, and so they may actually have their own post-Kemalist moments in their respective countries, and so we will probably have a mixed debate. Not a completely very positive, optimistic change, but also not a very pessimistic one, somewhere in between.
I feel that I agree with everyone, each one, when they speak. I don't know. It depends on the studies on, especially on Armenian genocide, issues like Armenian genocide, Kurdish issue, the scholars working on those topics are of critical importance, in the Turkish studies in Europe and the US. So their perspective is very critical to decide whether the debate on post-Kemalism would have a path-changing impact in these countries. So I think we should. I agree with Berk on some points, but I think we should wait and see, and we have to maybe start more English language discussions to come together with the people abroad, because now it's time, it's a chaotic time, a time of change, and we are waiting for a new general election. So the conditions in political life in Turkey are of critical importance for the scholarship on Turkey. That's why I'm hesitant to say anything, positive or negative, but we'll see.
So I think, well, first of all, obviously the outcome of the elections are important in having this discussion, but also how the opposition wins and with whom, right? So those two questions will also play an important role, right? The opposition, because right now we have an opposition alliance. At least 6 opposition parties are trying to establish an electoral alliance, but they have not yet succeeded, and they have not really put forward a candidate. Ironically, looking at, for instance, the CHP leadership, particularly Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, he comes across to me as a politician with some post-Kemalist sympathies, trying to sort of return back to the 1990s debates on headscarves, on many other conservative issues. Many of these problems have already been overcome, not just on political grounds, but at a societal level. And yet, in order to recruit conservative support, in order to recruit support from conservative voters, we actually, interestingly and ironically, see the CHP leadership go in that direction, cooperating actually with some post-Kemalist figures. Some of whom working as advisors for the CHP leader, and others sort of writing for pro-CHP venues. That's really an interesting sort of turn of events. But of course, if another candidate is nominated, one who's sort of more popular and younger, we may really experience a completely different opposition coalition win that election, and of course with completely different sort of outcomes. I mean, obviously, if the opposition can really defeat Erdogan at the polls, this is really going to herald the onset of a post-Kemalist era, what İlker mentioned 2 rounds ago. And I think at the societal level, what I personally see, the incoming sort of, the young generation is more urban, more educated, and more secular on average. And I think many of the cultural battles that have really fractured Turkish society in the 1990s and 2000s have been resolved, really not by politicians, but on practical grounds. And so I think the secularism problem is about to be resolved or overcome, especially under an opposition victory. Now, still members of the old generation may cling on to cultural politics, old debates, vendettas, their previous political loyalties. But even there, I think things are changing. So it'll be very, very difficult to put together a post-Kemalist coalition under an opposition victory. But this is not going to result in a return of Kemalists back to power, because if CHP had already changed its course, it's going to be really, really difficult to sort of bring forth old Kemalist ideas. What I hope is that we're going to end up with new and a much younger leadership, not just in CHP, but also in other opposition parties. And for this new generation of politicians to really cater to the bread and butter issues, economic concerns of the voters. We are experiencing a major economic crisis with severe consequences, especially for lower income voters. And these voters are mostly located in the urban areas, so they really feel the brunt of the high inflation and the increasing unemployment. And so I hope that this new generation that follows Erdogan will be able to reintegrate Turkey into international institutions, push for democratization, and basically address these economic issues. Once they are done, I think we will begin to have a more positive assessment of the Turkish Republic without really trying to push for restoration of the Kemalist paradigm or Kemalist ideas. In terms of important takeaway points from the Kemalist era: secularism, impersonal, bipartisan political institutions to overcome patrimonial politics, a peaceful foreign.
Yes, please.
I believe that we will continue to see the reassessment of laicism in Turkish studies, independent from the results of the elections. Because laicism, the secular policies of the Republic, although we criticize them a lot from different point of views, are of critical importance for the life of many sectors of society today, including the working class, the women, the LGBT community, or I don't know, with the women wearing headscarves. So it's like I feel, maybe because I'm a because I'm a woman, I feel that threat a lot. I think it's an issue of life and death now for many people. So, and I see a civilian, a civilian support, a civilian reaction against anti-secularism of the AKP, and I expect that would reflect, would have reflections in Turkish studies